the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center in Maysville, Kentucky, and right now in our Wormold gallery we are featuring World War II and the Holocaust. They go along with our Read On program, which is our literacy campaign where we're giving away free books. The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. It is a book about German-occupied France during World War II. In the beginning, in the 1930s, there were a lot of different ideologies. You had Nazism, fascism, you had communism, and then of course you had democracy. And with all of those different ideologies, they figured that half of the world is enchained and half of the world is free. And it was Adolf Hitler who decided that there should be a master race and that Germany should be in charge of everybody. So in 1939, they invaded Poland. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran on a ticket here in the United States of not entering World War II. We'd just gotten through with World War I and we're still paying for everything. And he won the election basically because he said we would not get involved in World War II. And in order to help out the Allies, because they were falling behind, in fact, by 1939, France had been occupied and only Britain was the only free area that was fighting against them. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt started the Lend-Lease program. And he said that by law, maybe we weren't involved in World War II, but in our hearts, we wanted to fight fascism. So we lended them planes, we lended them ammunition, and before 1941, the Red Cross had already gotten involved from the United States. We were giving clothes to the people that had been bombed and needed shelter and clothes and medicine. So we're going to walk on down. Started on trying to break codes, and the Polish in the 30s had broken some German codes, and they passed that on to us, and they used Enigma machines to break those codes. And a lot of women went in. If you were good at puzzles or patterns, you would probably be good at breaking the codes, and they were responsible for finding out what the Germans were passing along in coded messages. In the United States, it was called Magic, the group of people that worked together to break the Japanese codes. And because they were able to do that, the Battle of Midway was a victory for us. Again, in the 30s, the American Red Cross went in and helped. Britain was suffering the Battle of Britain. They lost 32,000 people in the very first 8 days of the Battle of Britain. Germany decided that they were going to come over and they were going to blitzkrieg London. And there was Operation Pied Piper, where they moved children to rural areas. If you've ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you know the kids go to live with C.S. Lewis, they were part of the Pied Piper. Those kids were the ones that were relocated into rural areas because they felt they were safer. In fact, London, the Humane Society sent out a paper that said that you needed to euthanize your pets because they wouldn't be able to feed their pets, or their pets could get hurt during the Blitz. And so hundreds and thousands of dogs and cats were killed at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. But then they realized that those animals were just important in warfare. The dogs could find bodies in the rubble and help with sending messages back and forth. Cats were used on ships to eat the rats, and it caused less disease. Even mice were used, but to determine if there were gas leaks or anything. Some of the neat things about World War II, penicillin was invented at that time, so that saved a lot of people. Plasma, the first blood transfusions were done during World War II. And while we're talking about the Battle of Britain, radar was first developed for World War II, and it was because of the radar that Britain won the Battle of Britain, because they could detect the German planes coming over. And there were also a lot of volunteers that would be out in the fields, civilian volunteers that could identify the planes, and they would message in who was going overhead, whether it was a British plane or a German plane or a Russian plane, so you would know who was headed your way. If you want to look at these particular planes, you've got the Spitfire that was very important during the Battle of Britain. This piece of paper was given to every pilot, so if they were shot down, it's got all the different languages to tell them, I'm an American pilot, please give me help. So that was pretty neat. And a lot of maps that the pilots had were done on parachute material, because you know, if you kept folding your paper, or if your paper got wet, it would be damaged. But if it was on material, you could roll it up, fold it up, and it wouldn't hurt it. You all might find this interesting. These are the guns and weapons that you would have found a lot of the Army men would have carried during World War II. General George Patton called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, and they said that the Germans could tell it had a clip, and if you ran out of bullets, the clip fell out, and the Germans could tell when you were out of ammunition because they could hear that clip fall. And when you put your clip in and you cocked it, you had to do it very quickly, because your thumb could get caught in that mechanism, and they called it the M1 thumb if you got caught hurt badly. This is a Japanese Courier pouch. You've got your German Luger, you've got your Colt back there. I think this one right here, the last ditch rifle, it's Japanese, but you can see the bayonet on the end of it. It swings out, which is kind of frightening. Because all the able-bodied men were going to World War II, women, for the very first time, got into the workforce. You know, it was always a woman's place to be in the home before then. And then when all the men moved out, the women were the ones responsible for building the planes, building the ships and everything. And that's when Rosie the Riveter became famous. A lot of different Rosies, but Roswell Monroe, she was from Kentucky, Pulaski County. And she was the Rosie the Riveter that was iconically made in a movie. So we credit Kentucky as having the very first Rosie the Riveter. The 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion was all female, all black women. And they were in charge of the letters that came back and forth. Battle of Britain. If you've ever watched the movie Dunkirk, and you know how everybody was stranded in France, they had the Dunkirk evacuation, and they had the little ships. And a lot of people, a lot of regular civilians would bring their little ships in because the big ones couldn't get into the harbor. And they evacuated several men. A lot of people had to swim out to the ships, and it did save them. Paris was taken over in 1940, and it affected a lot of the commerce that was going on, but it also developed French resistance, and we'll talk about that when we get upstairs. You want to go here? Because of war-torn Europe and things going on over there, we had to send, in the United States, we sent them food, and we had rations for metals and rubber. Women didn't get to wear girdles anymore because they had to use the rubber for their girdles for tires and things for the Jeeps and stuff. And they had victory gardens. You dig for victory and you grow your own garden because regular food had to be sent over to the troops. Meat must come in small chunks till we lick those Axis skunks. Axis was the bad guys and Allies were the good guys. And they would ration. You got ration cards. You know, you think you got it bad. You were rationed for gas, you were rationed for food, you were rationed for material. Women making clothes and stuff, that's when skirts got shorter and pleats went out of style because you were using so much material. You couldn't even use buttons except for closures. Buttons were considered decorative, so you didn't want to do that either. A lot of the local heroes that we have around here, Alex Parker, you'll see his banner up on 2nd Street, but he saw that his officer had fallen and they were under a lot of attack, and the rest of his group was getting out of the fire range, and he went 125 yards all by himself and pulled his officer back out of firing range. And very heroic. Wald Manufacturing here in Maysville, they produce bicycle parts. They stopped producing bicycle parts during the war, and they made grenades. These grenades shoot off the end of a rifle. And they also did bullets and other munitions, but they worked 24/7. They never closed. There were always different shifts. These souvenirs were from a missionary. He and his wife were over in the Philippines, and they were captured and they were prisoners of war. And these are some of the artifacts that they brought back. 1941, we finally joined the war. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. They take out a lot of the boats. They destroy at least half of the air machines that were to be used. And in fact, they say that Magic had deciphered information about Pearl Harbor, but it didn't get there soon enough. This is a Japanese flap cap. You'll see another bayonet. This is a Japanese sword currency. But when they attacked Pearl Harbor, then Franklin Roosevelt joined the war, and then Russia and, not Russia, but Italy and Germany declared war on the United States at that time, as well as Japan. So there were British prisoners of war leaving Hong Kong. I had a neighbor that went to Pearl Harbor the day after the attack, and he said they were pulling bodies out of the water, and the water was so warm that you know how when you boil chicken and the meat falls off the bone, that they would reach in and they would pull, and it was just horrendous. And there are still boats and bodies down at the bottom of the ocean there in Hawaii now. The Waves were the very first women to go into the military, and they had to be college educated or at least have a high school diploma and so many years of clerical work. And their job was to work in place of men in the clerical positions. And I think if you notice the hairstyle at the time, this is called a Liberty Roll. So everything, propaganda, a lot of advertisements, music, movies, everything was based on supporting the war. And what's his name? Tell me his name. Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell did a lot of the covers for Life magazine and everything. He did, based on a speech that Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave, he did the 4 freedoms, and those were the things that touched Americans' hearts. We had freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom of worship. because a lot of these people that were going into prisoner of war camps were political prisoners, some of them were religious prisoners. In other countries, you couldn't do what we can do in America. We're very, very fortunate. When you come over here, you'll see bonds. Americans, even children, 4 brothers went and they wrote letters to their parents and they collected them. So you might want to go back to that at some point in time. Even kindergartners were asked to buy bonds. And when you bought a bond, it was to put money into the military to help support, to pay for the munitions, to pay for their food, their medical, pay for the materials being built and sent over. And then you would get a certain percentage of it after the war. 1942 saw a little bit of change. We got penicillin, of course, for the first time, so it helped fight the disease. This is a wonderful family, the Coopers from Brooksville. They had 5 sons that went away to the war. Navajo code talkers. The Indians spoke a language that the Germans could never break, so they could send messages back and forth. The scary thing was that if a code talker got caught, they would be killed immediately by friendly forces because they didn't want them to be tortured, so that they would tell them the key to the code. You have ships, Kaiser built ships, Liberty ships here. He was also the same man that started the clothing drive for children and people in Britain and war-torn countries. You had the Tuskegee Airmen, all-black Air Corps group. Battle of Midway went on in 1942 and 43. Tokyo Rose, you would listen to the radio, and she was always busting the chops of the American GI and telling them how bad it was going to be for them. This is a troop train. Harry Mann does models, and this is Harry's troop train. But you can see all of the things that are being built to be shipped out across the pond. And the neat thing about the troop trains, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was one of the major generals during World War II, noticed how England had all of these roads that would quickly get to one place or another. Y'all are too young to remember before interstates, but if you had to drive all the way to Lexington, the old US 68, or if you had to drive all the way to Cincinnati the back way, it just was long and tedious, and they were, double-sided roads, and if you got behind somebody slow, you were stuck. Well, interstates were devised for national defense so that you could get back and forth quickly. So thank Eisenhower for those quick ways to get around. 1944, there were prisoners of war across, but a lot of people don't realize we had prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, here in Maysville. They kept them down at Wald Park, and in Kentucky, most of the prisoners were used in the agricultural fields. In Louisville, they worked on the golf courses. Here, they worked in the tobacco crops, and they saved the 1944 tobacco crop. In fact, there were young boys that were too young to go that would transport them from the prisoner of war camp to the fields, and one little boy did an oral history, wasn't young anymore, he was like in his 80s, and he said that they always wanted to get in his truck because he drove so fast, he got them back to the camp, and the first ones back to the camp got to the warm showers, so they always wanted to ride with him. But these are pictures of the prisoners of war, and a lot of them came back after the war to visit their friends here, and some of them relocated in the United States as well. This is a stool that was made by one of the prisoners. Mr. Sosley it was from Fleming County and from Elizaville. If you look at Iwo Jima, he is the soldier on the far left with his hand extended. And he was a Marine at Iwo Jima, and he told his mom, wrote her a letter and said, "Mom, watch the paper because there was a man that came and took our picture." He died several days after this. He was shot. But so he is one of our local heroes. 1945, finally, Battle of the Bulge. We've got other things going on, but in May, there was victory in Europe. And following in August, there was, we called it VJ Day, which was our VE Day. VJ was Victory of Japan, and of course that was because of the dropping of the atomic bomb. Audie Murphy was one of the most decorated men. You all are too young to remember Audie Murphy, but when I was growing up, he was always in the cowboy movies and army movies, but he was a very heroic Marine. And Japanese balloon bombs, the Japanese would send bombs on hot air balloons over, and they would float over the United States, and they thought that they would land and start forest fires and it would scare people. Well, in 1945 there was a group of picnickers in a park, and 5 kids and an adult went over. They found this big thing, they touched it, and it went off. They were the only American civilians killed on the continent during World War II. 90 to 100% of the Jewish population went to gas chambers. Hitler was into the Aryan race. He felt that the German, blonde, blue-eyed human was the most perfect human, and he was ready to get rid of, genocide, anybody that was not. And the Jewish population was probably hardest hit. But it wasn't just Jewish people that they targeted. They targeted some Catholics, they targeted political prisoners, they hit homosexuals, they hit anybody that would have been considered lower on the echelon, and even taught the children. Here, students in Berlin, they're blind students, but they're taught to examine racial heads so that they could tell the difference between the races. We have a degenerate music concert that's going to be over in the Opera House, and Hitler believed that certain arts were not to be shown because they were from Jewish painters. Black music, jazz was banned. So there were a lot of things that he targeted. And if you look right here, you'll see the different flags that were worn by the different prisoners. This would have been a political prisoner. And that, you could have been arrested just for simply handing out brochures against fascism or communism, or to fight in the resistance. Dachau was probably the first time the American public realized about the genocide. There was the American soldiers went into Dachau, and they found dead bodies where the Germans were just trying to get rid of everybody. A lot of them starved, a lot of them went to the gas chambers. A lot of them had experiments done on them. These particular things were experiments that were given, and this person is going through high altitude experiments. Like, if they did a lot of experiments on women in Ravensbrück camp that were Polish women, and they would insert shrapnel in their leg. And they might put like some kind of things that you would have gotten in an injury, and they wouldn't do anything for it. And they would find out what it did to your body. They did experiments with children as well. Mendel This is the Ravens group, and you see where they've worked on the legs and everything. They called these girls the bunnies, and because they hopped everywhere, because they were basically mangled, but they would insert things and then examine to see how it affected their bodies. Eva and her sister Miriam were part of Mengele's experiments, and they chose Eva to do the experiments on. They would give her things and they would see how her body would react, and Miriam was the control. They would just, she would just go through life. But Eva realized that if she died, they would immediately kill her twin. So that was one of her reasons for trying to hang on and to live. Okay, zero in on these people, but French resistance, it wasn't only in France, it was in any occupied territory. The Dutch had a resistance, the Polish had a resistance, even the Germans had a resistance. The Germans, one of their resistance was the White Rose, and it was a group of school kids, and they would write pamphlets and propaganda against the Reich, and somebody had messed up on one of their pamphlets and they threw it out the window of their school, and the janitor found those pamphlets and turned them in, and they ended up killing those kids as political prisoners just for voicing their opinion against the Reich. A lot of brave people, and Josephine Baker was an early iconic entertainer of the jazz age. And she was in Paris, and because of her status as an actress and cabaret entertainer, she took her music and did messages on her music in invisible ink, and she was able to transfer it across the borders. And she also knew that the Germans held her in such high regard because she would go to the parties and everything, and she'd hear all the stuff going on. She'd pin messages in her underwear because she knew that they wouldn't check her, they wouldn't give her a search. So she was able to transfer important messages for that. Audrey Hepburn, if you all remember Breakfast at Tiffany's or any of the Audrey Hepburn movies back in the 40s, she was a young girl in Holland, and her family started out being sympathizers of the Reich, and then her uncle was killed because he was a noted person in the community, and some of the Germans got killed, so they took regular citizens and killed them in retaliation, and then he was one of them. So then they decided, and they hid some British paratroopers in their basement. Well, Audrey was young. She was probably just around 13, and she would send messages. The doctor in the town was in the resistance, and she would send medicine, and she would carry food to any of the hidden prisoner or hidden paratroopers. And then she was also a ballet student, and she would dance ballet in basements to make money for the resistance. But the audience couldn't clap because they couldn't make any sounds because they didn't want anybody to hear that they were down there. And if you notice Audrey's body in any of her movies, you'll notice how thin and lank, and they think it was because of her starvation during that time. They eventually had to go into hiding themselves, and food was so scarce they even ate tulip bulbs and weeds to survive, and then they were liberated by the Canadians. Marcel Marceau, you remember the mime you always see? He was in the resistance, and he started out moving children, getting them to be quiet like a mime, and he would be able to transport them around. One that I didn't know was a resistance fighter I thought was pretty neat. Chuck Yeager was the man that broke the sound barrier. He was a test pilot, but in World War II, he was from West Virginia, and his daddy was a well digger. And he was shot down over France, and the resistance was helping him get back over the Pyrenees, and he taught the resistance how to make bombs because his dad had taught him during the well digging days. And he and another man were traveling with the resistance over the mountains, the Pyrenees mountains, and that man had hung his socks out to dry because they were going across snow and stuff. And there was a German troop that went through, and they saw those socks, and they knew they were American socks, so they just started shooting into the house. And Chuck Yeager and this man jumped out the back window to get away and everything, and that man was wounded in the leg, and Chuck carried him to Switzerland because of his wounded leg. Great man. We talked about the ladies at Ravenscraft or Ravensbrook that they've done the experiments on their legs, and they called them the bunnies because they hopped. Caroline Faraday was a socialite from the United States, and after the war, she helped a lot of those women come over and get medical assistance. One really neat thing, you never know what you're going to find when you're cleaning out your grandparents' attic or closets, but this man was a lawyer, Mr. Miller. William Miller was a lawyer here in Mason County, and he was a lawyer for the Nuremberg trials. They're the ones that prosecuted the German, that did a lot of the horrific things. And we had a lot of Holocaust survivors come to Kentucky and stay. Tonight, Friday night at 7:30, we have the Monuments Men showing at the Russell Theater. It's free to the public, and Hitler gave Alfred Rosenberg the task to collect all of this wonderful art, and they went through and they took beautiful art, and it wasn't just art. They stole gold, they stole important books, they stole important statues and items, and they were going to put them in this Hitler's museum, and they were collected from all over the world. Some of these items they never found, like the Amber Room, they're still searching for that. The Germans went in, and the Russians had tried to conceal it. They tried to save it, but they realized that the amber kind of splintered when they took it off. So they covered it with wallpaper. Well, the Russians knew what was going on, and they dismantled it. They don't know whether it was an assault mine that had been bombed. They don't know if it had been put on a ship that was bombed and it's now at the bottom of the ocean. They don't know if it was in a train and it's stuck in a train tunnel somewhere, but they've never been able to find the Amber Room. A lot of the items the Germans destroyed before they could be saved. But there's a wonderful documentation movie made called The Monuments Men that George Clooney, Bill Murray, a lot of it. It's got a great cast, but it talks about the architects, the artists, and that went in and tried to save the art. And where they found them, they found a lot of them in castles, they found them on salt mines, more art that was taken. Another movie, I think it was the Woman in Gold, but this painting was hung in a lady's home. They were very wealthy Jewish merchants, and this necklace, the last time she saw this necklace was on Himmler's wife in a photograph. So never saw it again, but they recovered the painting. Finally, it's back. Jewish children probably had a very hard life because the majority of the children would have been killed unless they were aged that they could work. And so the younger ones, their parents would give them to other people to hide them. There's one story of a lady who was a teacher, and she was hiding children, and the Germans came, they checked her house and everything like that, and she said, I guess they figured that as soon as they left, the kids would come out of hiding, and they did, and the Germans came back. And she said, all I could do was kill the German to save the children. And she said it just matter-of-factly, you know, I cannot imagine. But when they went into hiding, they couldn't show any Judaism. So a lot of the children were given to families, and they were hiding under different religions. Some of them were safe in hiding, some of them were not. You know, it's just like a foster home. You don't know if you're going to get a good parent or somebody that's going to take advantage. One of the most famous hidden children, of course, was Anne Frank. And one neat thing that I didn't know, Anne Frank had a pen pal in the United States, and she started writing her. The little girl was from Iowa, and she started writing her, and all of a sudden the letter stopped. And she realized after the fact that was when Anne started going into hiding. And then, of course, the family was found, and Anne died of typhus in a camp. But these pictures of hidden children, they had to play games that were quiet games. She couldn't take her marbles with her. She couldn't take her animals with her. They studied, and then after the war, there were custody battles because of the families that adopted these kids or hid them got so close. And some of the children were so young when they were taken from their families, they didn't know their mom and dad. They didn't know. So a lot of things like that. Irina Sindler was a nurse. She was Polish. But she would go into the hospitals, and if she saw a child that she knew was going to be terminated because they looked Jewish or they were Jewish, she would put them in her bag, her medical bag, and sneak them out. A lot of people like that. This Maysville woman was one of the hidden children, and she was protected by her babysitter. Realized what was going on. She was riding through town and she heard what was going on, that people were being gathered to be deported, and she rode her bicycle to the house, and she quickly got this little girl, and her name was Evelyn Bosnick, but got her to safety.